Hey you guys, in this video I'm going to detail for you what an argument essay looks like. I'll also be breaking down what a counter-argument looks like. So let's get started here. All that an argument really is a well thought out logical assertion of a point. So what we're going to do is we're going to take an issue or a topic, especially a topic that's of controversy, and we're going to make a claim. So we're going to choose to argue either for or against that particular controversial issue. We're also going to support our claim with reasons and evidence. So an effective argument has 4 parts in addition to other essay parts. So other essay parts would be like an introduction paragraph and a conclusion paragraph. But essentially we're going to make a clear position. So that's what I also call a claim. You could think of this as your thesis as well. A claim is a thesis. We are arguing in favor, for, or against, and that is the main idea of the whole essay. We're also going to give strong reasons, solid support, which are evidence, and then we're going to also include a counter-argument. Your book often calls a counter-argument a refutation, so just be aware that you could use either word in this particular case. So convincing arguments are when writers are able to appeal to the readers on 3 particular levels. I will not be testing you on this in class, but this often comes up in English 1A, so just to sort of prepare you for that. Logos, ethos, and pathos. So logos is simply an appeal to the reader's intellect, presenting them with logical reasoning and reliable evidence, right? So we're making that, as a writer, we're making that assumption that, hey, look, my writers are really smart people who understand that I'm going to have to give them a really strong case in order for them to believe me. Ethos is when we appeal to the reader's perception of the writer's credibility and fairness, right? If a writer isn't being really fair, isn't being very credible, they give us crappy sources, right? We begin to question their ability to reason really well. And lastly, pathos is the appeal to a reader's values and feelings, right? We anticipate our audience. We're really aware of what they need in order to be convinced, or if they're already convinced, how we can perhaps offer them something new or different. So asserting a clear position. In the introduction of your argument essay, you are going to basically tell us what that issue is and why is it controversial. For some topics, you might actually have to give a little bit of history. So for example, if you were writing about pulling down Confederate statues, you might want to kind of give some current context to what that means, right? In 2016 and 2017, we had hundreds of statues, especially all over the South, of Confederate soldiers being pulled down or removed or placed somewhere else other than parks and schools and things like that. So you might want to sort of explain to the reader why this is a controversy right now, right? Some other topics might not necessarily require a whole lot of explanation on why it's controversial or why it's relevant right at the moment. Some topics just seem to be relevant all the time, so it just kind of depends. So you have to really think about how to frame that particular argument, right? You'll also want to choose a side, and you'll want to make that clear in the introduction. We're not withholding that information from the reader until the very end of the essay. We're going to make that very apparent from the very beginning. What side of this controversy do we fall on? And the best way to do that is essentially in your thesis, right? Which is the main point of your essay. In one sentence, what is your argument, right? Make sure you present that clearly and simply, and if you can, preview the reasons that you're going to use as support. So think of an essay map here, if you can get all that in there, right? Something I want to point out here, because this might help you long term when you go into the next English course and you're thinking about, oh my gosh, how am I going to write that 7-page or 10-page essay? This is the key right here, is that thesis and that essay map. If you need to write an essay that is 10 pages long, you may want to explore having a more complex thesis and maybe perhaps more reasons to add in there. So that way you actually need the room. You need 10 pages to explain that particular topic and how controversial and what are all the many reasons that go into that. So that's just a side note there for you. Arguable thesis. So a strong arguable thesis does not need to begin with I think, I believe, or in my opinion. We've talked about that already in this class, so hopefully that's starting to feel more familiar to you, right? And you can see in the red right here, I wrote, in my opinion, the use of animals in testing should be prohibited. If you find yourself writing a sentence like that as just a working thesis, you can still write a sentence like that, but before you put it into your outline or your essay, right, just get rid of the words in my opinion, right? And just leave the use of animals in testing should be prohibited. Okay, that's better than the last version. An argument's thesis should focus on a narrowed issue. So when I look here at the use of animals in testing should be prohibited, it's a little vague, right? It's a little too broad. What kind of animals? What kind of testing? Are we talking about medical testing? Are we talking about all animals? Are we talking about dogs or cats, right? And prohibited maybe where? There's lots of testing that goes on in products that we consume and use every day. And that testing does not happen here in the United States, but it takes place in China. So also note that this particular example is too narrow. If I narrow this down to the testing of Victoria's Secret's beauty products on rabbits should be prohibited, which yes, this is actually a thing. Victoria's Secret often test their beauty products on rabbits. That testing is done in China. Here's actually a photo of some of those products on rabbits. But that might be too narrow. I might not be able to find enough research specifically on Victoria's Secret, specifically on rabbits, right? So that might just be too small of an essay, right? I want to be thinking of how many pages do I have to write, how many sources do I have to incorporate, and so I want to sort of focus that thesis to fit the assignment. So here's a focus thesis. The testing of cosmetics and skincare products on animals should be prohibited. Now, again, I can make that even a better version, right? Because I've narrowed now, instead of saying Victoria's Secret, I can actually say cosmetics and skincare products. So I could open it up to a whole range of a whole bunch of different beauty suppliers and manufacturers, right? Perhaps I could even make this better by clarifying what kind of animals there. But again, remember, a working thesis is something you're going to keep tweaking and keep working on. So notice here is a thesis with an essay map. So the testing of cosmetics and skincare products on animals should be prohibited because it is cruel to animals and there are more effective testing measures available. So notice here in this particular thesis with an essay map, I have two distinct reasons that I've added on to that thesis. So the first reason is because it's cruel. So hopefully I would have a body paragraph or maybe even two that explains what the cruelty is, what kind of testing, what are the results of that testing? Do animals often die? Does their skin burn? Do they, are they infertile? Does their hair fall out, right? I would probably detail all of those things. The second point that this essay map makes is that there are other more effective testing measures available. So again, hopefully in my essay, I detail what are those other effective testing measures. How do they test on computers, for instance, and find the things that will hurt us or kill us? Or, is it based on old data, right? I would want to detail those things out for my readers. So this is our goal right here, is having a focus thesis, one that we can tackle within a reasonable amount of pages, and also an essay map. So you're going to try for those kinds of things, but we'll get there. Notice down here, as I mentioned on the last slide, about having a more complex thesis, right? A complex thesis is a thesis that's going to acknowledge that there are both good and bad sides of a complex issue. And I would use this complex thesis if I was writing a big honkin' paper. So for me, I might open up this idea of testing on animals, perhaps to the medical industry as well, right? For many of us, we might feel like testing for beauty products feels like that's frivolous and we shouldn't really maybe hurt animals for those reasons, but perhaps for medical breakthroughs, right? Research on cancer, right? All the vaccines that we get that make us healthy and hopefully well, right? Maybe that we can justify that kind of testing is okay, but this other kind is not. So just as, again, as sort of a side note to how to write that complex thesis, here we go. Although there have been some medical breakthroughs that have occurred with the testing of medicines on animals, much of the current medical testing on animals is cruel and unnecessary, right? So in fact, in this case, I'm sort of saying actually a little bit of both here with response to medical testing, right? That it's cruel and unnecessary, right? But we have gotten a lot of really wonderful medicine out of that kind of testing. So reasons. Your body paragraphs are going to provide detailed reasons supported by the evidence to back up your claim. And remember that the claim is your thesis here. You are claiming that you are for or against a particular controversy. Often one paragraph is devoted to one specific reason. So hopefully that reason should be stated clearly in a topic sentence, and then the remainder of the paragraph is going to consist of evidence and logic that's going to help support that topic sentence and connect it back to your claim. Sometimes students have a hard time knowing what kind of evidence is convincing. And so in general, what we're typically looking for in terms of evidence are facts, statistics, charts, graphs, right? Examples, maybe even personal experiences or expert testimony that's going to help support that reason, right? The more credible your evidence is, right? Meaning that if it comes from an expert, I'm more likely to believe it than if your friend John said it's true, right? So someone who's working and actively dealing with research or parts of, whatever is pertinent to that particular topic, I'm going to much more likely believe that particular expert than I am just anybody else. So there's a great test that you can use here. It's called the CRAP test, and it comes from Chico State. Let's take a look at that. So all that the CRAP test means is that there are 5 it's an acronym. You know how English instructors are. They love their acronyms. But it's an acronym that helps us remember the things that we're going to be looking for, the criteria that we're going to evaluate to make sure that our outside source meets our credibility test, right? So if you'll notice here, C for currency, R for relevance, A for authority, A for accuracy, and P for purpose. So all that currency means is timeliness of the information. So when was the information published? Has it been revised or updated, right? So what I want you to think of here when you think about the timeliness is it current? If you're looking at research that's 15 years old, it's probably not current anymore. Think about how fast the digital age moves, and not that research itself is a fast process, but publishing it is much more quick than it used to be. And so we want to think about using research that is new and current. And I would say current is typically 5 to 10 years, kind of depending on your topic. If you're dealing with something in the digital age, for instance, if you write on a topic on social media, you really should be looking at probably 5 years or less, right? You're not going to go back any more than that because that's no longer current information. Relevance. So this is the importance of the information for your needs. So does that information relate to your topic or answer your question? I see students sometimes get really lazy when it comes to their research, and they will Google their topic and they think that they found, a piece of research that kind of meets their needs. But really, when I check that source, that information isn't related to their topic. It just so happened that Google picked up a word or two that the student had ended up Googling. And so they thought that that would count as some sort of relevant outside source, and it doesn't. So look at the relevancy. I would also include if that information is at an appropriate level. Again, this is a common mistake that I see. I see students find really difficult, sophisticated, highly academic journals. And that would be great if I knew that student had read that entire piece of evidence and understood all of it. But sometimes, again, and I think this is true of maybe some lazier students, is that they look up an article and they think, oh, that sounds pretty awesome. They don't actually read it and they just pull a quote out of there. So if you find yourself in that situation where you're about to quote something, right, and you're not sure that that's appropriate maybe for your level, if it's too advanced for you to read that entire piece, you should probably find a different piece of evidence to use. because the assumption is, as your instructor, right, and as a reader, I believe that you have read that entire piece of evidence and you understand it completely. So again, if you don't, if it's too over your head, and believe me, you guys, there are lots of articles on there that are over my head too. So it's not like that's just true of you because you're college students and you're just starting out. There are lots of academic articles out there that I have a hard time dealing with because they're just too wordy, or their vocabulary is really specific to their industry, and those are words I'm not familiar with. So don't be afraid to just keep looking for something else, okay? Authority. So who is the author publisher, right? Again, this is a really important component, because if it's just a staff writer at a newspaper or a magazine, that's going to be less credible than probably an expert, again, who's dealing with research in that particular field. Although a journalist, right, at a credible news outlet is probably much more credible than just a blog, right? So know who is writing the piece. Sometimes with particular websites, it's not really clear who is writing something. And my gut feeling on that is usually, if I don't know who's writing it, I might not actually want to incorporate that into my own work. Unless I feel it's really strong and striking, perhaps then I can maybe use that. But to me, a lot of the, if a piece is well researched and well written, a writer is going to take credit for that, and we should know who that writer is. Oftentimes their credentials are listed up at the top next to their name, or perhaps at the bottom. Also pay attention to these things, right? .com, .edu, .gov, .org, .net, right? There is sort of a hierarchy when it comes to these URLs. A .com really isn't that reliable. Think of commerce. Think of money being exchanged, right? A .com exists for money-making purposes, right? We could better trust an edu or a government website. Does that mean they're always 100% true and factual? No, not always, right? So again, .coms, .orgs, and .nets way less credible than other particular websites. That said, I just want to make a note here about Wikipedia. Students oftentimes turn to Wikipedia, and I want to emphasize that sometimes Wikipedia can be helpful if we just need quick information on something. So for instance, someone yesterday had mentioned a movie I had never heard of, and I felt like I should know this movie. It seemed kind of familiar, but I wasn't really sure, so I ended up sort of Googling it, and the first thing that came up was a Wikipedia plot summary, and I read that really fast and realized that, yes, I had seen that movie before. It was familiar to me, right? So in that particular case, the stakes are low, right? I'm not regurgitating that information. I'm just using it as a quick reference point. However, incorporating that into research, not a great idea. Wikipedia can be edited by anyone, right? And there are plenty of people out there who actively work to add things to Wikipedia to make them funny or not true, right? So we do not want to use this as a reliable source. It is not a reliable source at all, right? Accuracy. So that means the reliability, truthfulness, and correctness of the content. This plays into authority a little bit. Sometimes people pay for particular research. Sometimes people pay for, other information to be, used in a particular way. I'll give you an example. There are lots of studies out there on Coca-Cola, and that say that their products do not cause cancer, right? Oftentimes those studies are actually paid for by the company themselves. So they have a vested interest in not revealing what are some of the really negative side effects of drinking that particular product, right? So thinking about that kind of thing, right? Who is paying for this thing? Why is it reliable, right? These are just questions you're asking yourself. A lot of times, you guys, you can find that particular information pretty quickly just by doing a couple of searches on verifying who, right? Where did this information come from, right? So you're just looking for these key kind of things. Lastly, we have purpose, right? The reason the information exists. Is it to inform? Is it to teach? If it's to sell you something, again, I would be suspect of why that information exists. Okay, so again, that's for your own purpose. If you would like, you can certainly go to this page, print up this particular page, and leave that next to you at your desk while you're working and you're looking up research, right? So counterargument. So a strong counterargument will recognize opposing viewpoints. So the first part of our counterargument, and let me say this, I kind of said it here at the bottom, but your counterargument should be one full body paragraph in which you acknowledge the opposing viewpoint's strongest argument, right? So it's one full body paragraph that we are dedicating to the other side's view, right? So one strong argument they have on the opposite side. So we acknowledge that that opposing side exists, right? And that we've given it serious consideration, right? We're not saying we're 100% right. In fact, there are two ways we can sort of approach acknowledging this, right? One is we can accommodate the reader's concerns. That means that, hey, we know that this other side exists, right? And we understand that that might be a flaw in our particular argument. Or we might do what's called a refutation, and your book talks about this a lot. You acknowledge a reader's concerns, but then you demonstrate why this is still wrong. You demonstrate its weakness. So your counter-argument is going to do all of these things. It's going to acknowledge, right? And then it's either going to accommodate or refute. You have to pick one or two. In the best case scenario, if you're making the strongest argument possible, you're going to make a refutation. That's the best way to handle this. So if you're thinking right now, wait, what am I supposed to do? I would just do the refutation itself. It's a much stronger way to approach that. However, I will say that there are arguments out there, and you do have to understand that, you might have to take this as an approach where you sort of say, yeah, the other side's right on this point, right? This is a concern, and here's why. All right. And then lastly, you have your conclusion, right? And you can always turn back to your strategies at the beginning of the book on conclusions, but particularly for a conclusion in an argument essay, you can offer a solution to the problem. Perhaps you might do a call to action. So what can your readers do now that they know all of the information out there? You can make an implication to sort of broader maybe global problems or national problems, right? Or if we don't change our ways, what's going to be the result? Where will we ultimately end up? Or depending on how you started your introduction, you can certainly connect back to that introduction. If you're talking about immigration, for instance, and you give us an anecdote, perhaps a story you read or you saw, an anecdote about maybe a particular immigrant being deported for whatever reasons, maybe you can come back to that. Like what sort of happened at the conclusion. So you can sort of bookend your essay with that particular example. Lastly, I want to point out here that your works cited, this is what should be the first thing that you actually put together. Not the last thing. You don't wait until the last moment to put your works cited together. This is often really frustrating for students if you wait until the last moment, and let me tell you why. Because over several weeks of writing an essay like this, where you're doing lots of research and lots of articles, you are likely to get those articles. They will get jumbled in your head unless you're super organized. And when you go to submit your essay and your works cited isn't done all along the way, you are going to have a hard time remembering what was what quote goes with what author, right? So I strongly suggest to my students as they are doing research to go ahead and open up that Word document and start to put together the works cited as they're doing it. This will help you remember. It will also be a great reference point. There's nothing more frustrating than writing at 3 o'clock in the morning and being like, oh my gosh, I remember reading that article. Where was it? Right? And you can't remember, and you do another search and you can't find it. So creating that works cited page as one of the first things that you do in your research process, again, really, really wise. That is a tip of the wise to you. Make sure it contains all the outside sources that you consulted. So even if you directly or indirectly, right, maybe paraphrase or summarize a source, you still have to list that source on your works cited page. So anything that you read that informed you while you were writing has to go back into that works cited page. All of your citations are going to be listed alphabetical by last name, or if there wasn't a name associated with that, by title of that particular article. And make sure you consult your book or on the OWL Purdue of how to list those different types of sources. All right, let's look at counterargument. So I just briefly want to go over counterargument here a little bit more in depth, so that way you have a better idea of what it should look like. So essentially, having a counterargument means that you have considered all the arguments for and against your topic. This is really important for you to look like the most reasoned arguer out there. It makes you look really well informed. It's not that you just arrived at that opinion based on nothing. Your readers are going to be more convinced because you've done all the work on that. You're really knowledgeable, and it increases your credibility as a writer. So, counterargument should acknowledge one viewpoint of the opposition. It should acknowledge a strong argument of the opposition. So you don't want to choose the weakest argument that your opposing side has. That's actually a logical fallacy called a straw man. So you want to make sure that you pick a really good argument that the other side has, right? And say why they are wrong. That's ultimately like what I want you to get out of this. So in this essay, you only need one particular counter argument, although you should know now that many essays incorporate more than one counter argument. There's a particular style of essay that you might be encountering in the next English class you take, in which you write counter arguments for every body paragraph. You know, you do point, counterpoint, point, counterpoint, that kind of thing. So in this particular essay, your counter argument should be one body paragraph. So how to counter. So the first part of this body paragraph, again, I just mentioned that a few minutes ago, but I really just kind of wanted to take a moment to talk about it again, because sometimes I think this is one of the hardest parts of this particular essay, is to really understand like what the function of the counter argument should be. So all we have to do in the first part of this paragraph is we acknowledge that the opposing argument exists, right? We say what that is, right? And perhaps we go ahead and start to transition into why, right? We are either agreeing with that side, or we're going to prove why it's wrong. Again, if you're unclear of how to approach this, whether you should accommodate or refute, I would ultimately try to refute if you can. A refutation just simply says that we're going to say why that opposing idea is wrong, and we're going to prove why that it's still wrong. In an accommodation, essentially we're saying that, yeah, the opposing side, they're right or they're partially right, and here's why. If you'll notice that this is the weaker way to sort of argue, and sometimes, again, it just depends on your topic. We have to make accommodations. Not every argument is very black and white, right? Sometimes there are very gray areas, and even if we have a strong opinion about something, sometimes we have to say, you know, that's kind of a good reason. I understand why people might feel like that. And then the third part of this counter argument, and the most important part, is you're going to prove why your thesis is still correct, hopefully by providing some kind of research to support that. Go in here. So, better information equals healthier eating. This comes from your book on page 324. Essentially what a writer does here, right, and you can see by the thesis, is she sort of argues that the new 2014 FDA calorie labeling rules should also be applied to all campus food establishments. So she's just saying, hey, we have this new rule from the Food, Drug, and Administration about labeling calories, and this should be true for all of our campus food places. She gives us 3 distinct reasons here. The first one is for the government has already officially recognized that we should have that. The second reason she gives us is that the federal guidelines are reasonable, flexible, and fair. And the third, right, is that campus food outlets that have chains will already have to go ahead and post nutritional information by the end of 2015, right? So what she does in the counter argument, so what she does here is she acknowledges that the opposition is going to say, yeah, but our customized food service, it's too complex to put accurate nutritional information. If someone orders a particular salad, right, that they can put whatever they want on it, and the amount of what they put on there is going to affect the nutritional value, right? And she says what to that? Oh, I actually didn't write that down, huh? She ultimately says, yeah, I can understand that In fact, I'm looking at my book right now on page 326. She says, while it is true that individuals could assemble a custom meal from the salad bar or sandwich bar in the student center, better labeling would reveal the calorie counts for each individual ingredients. Meaning that if a student were to pile, and she gives us an example of high calorie ranch dressing on a healthy spinach salad, if that nutritional information were already available for the ranch dressing, a student would be aware of how high calorie and how dense that particular food item is, right? So she's saying, yeah, I understand that it could be hard for those food establishments to put that nutritional information there, right? Having nutritional information available on those customizable things is actually still a good thing because students will be aware. So does that make sense how she's kind of tackling that particular counter argument? She's actually making a rebuttal here. She's saying, yeah, I understand. However, they're still wrong, and here's why. That's what you ultimately want to do in your particular counter argument. So, the way that I would tackle writing a counter argument, if you are unfamiliar, is to start with a reason. So start with a good, strong argument that your opposition would hold. Sometimes what this takes is for you to look at your brainstorm, maybe a particular reason that didn't quite fit in with your thesis. Maybe you actually did a pro-con list. That's a great idea too. I often have to brainstorm, what would the other side say? If I was going to argue the other side, what would be my reasons to support that? So start with one reason. And then I might use a paragraph starter, like one of these two things, right? Although critics of this, and then whatever it is, right, would argue that, and again, you have to sort of fill in the blank depending on your topic. However, here's the reason why these critics are still wrong, right? So again, this is just kind of a sentence starter to help you a little bit. In the second version here, you can insert a specific critic, right? If you happen during your research to come across a critic whose viewpoint is different than yours, go ahead and use it as a counter argument, right? Why not? Go ahead and list that particular critic or perhaps the particular reason that the critic believes, right? And maybe you can just turn that specific research on its head a little bit, or specific reasoning on its head. So remember that your counter argument should be one full body paragraph, because you have to spend time research, to spend the time, the research and logic arguing why that point is specifically wrong. The counter argument does not mean you contradict your thesis. Okay, so be sure you do not undermine your thesis here. Your job is still to maintain that your thesis is the correct one. So hopefully that helps you kind of start to distill what argument is and what counter argument is.